Okay, welcome back. Thanks for joining me here. We are currently talking part two of chapter 5, which is all about radio. Now, if you haven't seen part 1 yet, I would highly recommend you watch that because it will definitely help you with your latest homework assignment in this week's module. I go into the numbers in radio. I also talk about podcasting and its meteoric rise in its importance in society, and then cap it off with giving you some suggestions on who you might want to listen to for your homework assignment. So if you've not seen it, I would highly recommend carving out some time to watch it. It is lengthy, as will this one be, but that is why I'm giving you, basically 2 weeks worth of time to get through radio, because I think it's that important. So anyway, let's get to part 2 today, which is obviously all about the history. We're actually going to be circling back. We're going to be circling back to modern radio at the end of this lecture. So we can't start radio or history of radio without talking about Samuel Morse. Now, you may have heard of him. You may have heard of Morse code. Morse code, of course, if you've ever heard it, is the dots and the that kind of thing that you can hear. I remember one of my favorite memories as a kid was going to Disneyland, and if you go to New Orleans Square where the railroad is, you could always hear kind of the telegraph as you stood on the platform waiting for the train, and I always thought that was the coolest thing ever. So that is actually Morse code, and what Morse code is basically it was created by Samuel Morse. It was the idea that you could communicate for the first time in human history instantly at the speed of light. Now, how did that work? Well, it was initially on a wire. He initially developed a wired system where you had somebody at who had that knew how to obviously operate a small device. You would go into this Western Union office, because eventually Samuel Morse's company becomes Western Union. You'd go into this office with a message. You would give the message to the operator, and that person would basically translate your message into a series of dots and dashes that would then go through a wire, come out the other end in another city, another town, and then that would be obviously translated and then handed off to someone that it was intended for, right? And so it seems crazy today, because obviously all you got to do is pick up a phone and send a text message, call somebody. It's all so simple today, including being able to FaceTime somebody. But the telegraph was the very first. That was created in 1837, and that actually led to that was kind of the headwaters of a number of different forms of mass communication that, of course, that we take for granted today. But the first was radio. So let's talk about how radio connects to telegraph, right? Well, first of all, telegraph was created in 1837. Again, instant communication, speed of light, 186,000 miles per second. By 1861, that telegraph, a wired system, was going coast to coast. And then by 1866, the transatlantic cable, so that was the one that went under from basically from North America to Europe, that was built, right? The interesting thing, though, is that at this point, it was not, it was unable to transmit the human voice, right? It was a code, basically. And it wasn't wireless, which becomes kind of important, because obviously when this wired system comes along, now we start to see some scientists come along, physicists, inventors, that take Samuel Morse's idea and start to tinker, okay? So the first tinkerers are James Maxwell. He theorized the existence of electromagnetic waves in the 1860s. He believed a portion of those waves, later known as radio waves, could be harnessed to transmit signals. And so I am not a physicist or an engineer, so it's very hard for me to describe this. But basically, it was the idea of being able to say, well, if I can stand there and look at a wire, I can see a message going through a wire why couldn't why couldn't we do this with in between two receivers, but not have wires, right? So, clearly that was something that was cooking. Heinrich Hertz, another big name from the past. He proved Maxwell's theories in the 1880s, so it takes about 20 years. He advanced the development of wireless communication. He actually was the first to successfully send and detect radio waves. Now, not voice. That's not the thing here. This is all about just basically trying to imitate Morse code through a wireless system as opposed to on a wire. All right. Important to know that. All right. Another big, huge name in the industry is a guy by the name of Guglielmo Marconi. Okay. So he was interested in sending Morse code over large distance and between commercial and military ships. And he actually, in working on this, received a patent in England in 1896. And believe it or not, Marconi's actual experiments and later inventions also led to, when we start talking about things during World War I and RCA and the formation of RCA, that a lot of it was in connection to Marconi's company. But he was English, and this was 1896. One of the interesting things about Marconi is that he telegraphed the results of the America's Cup yacht race that was being sailed on the ocean, obviously off the Atlantic coast. He was able to successfully broadcast those results back to shore so that people on the shore could get results in 1899. So, even back then, a sporting competition, was a pretty big deal in terms of the history of wireless radio, right? Alexander Popov made parallel discoveries in Russia at the same time. And then you have Nikola Tesla, who invented a wireless system in 1892. Marconi used much of Tesla's work. And what's interesting about Nikola Tesla is, depending on the textbook, some textbooks don't even mention Tesla's inventions, but because Marconi, for decades, a lot of his, was credited with being the quote unquote father of radio, if you will. And it wound up actually being Nikola Tesla because Marconi was using Tesla's work. And it wasn't until after Tesla died that he was deemed the official inventor of radio in 1943. So look that up because it's very, very interesting, I think. It's a very interesting part of our, an interesting part of our history. All right. Also, I should say, playing in the wireless sandbox, right, is a guy named Lee DeForest, who wrote the first PhD thesis on wireless technology in 1899. You can see each of these guys were slowly building off of, sort of the work of the other. He patented what was called the Audion signal detector, which allowed radio signals to be amplified. So that was a big deal because, up until this point, it was, these radio signals, wireless radio signals could only have a certain amount of range. And he was one of the first that really kind of figured out how to make it, much, much broader, right? So, but the interesting thing is because he was working on this and Marconi was doing his things at the same time, they oftentimes were running into frequency issues. They were often crossing each other on the wireless, scale, if you will, right? Well, then you have Reginald Fessenden, and this becomes, so everything up to this point, guys, had basically been not just wireless, but it wasn't voice, and it was just code, right? It was more Morse code being transmitted, through a wireless system so that, that ships and radio operators on the shore could kind of, could basically decode messages. Well, Reginald Fessenden changes the game with his first voice broadcast. And he did it on Christmas Eve in 1906. And he was the first to broadcast words and music and did so. And of course, it was a complete mind blower at the time because, again, think about it. This is the first time anyone would have heard this. So, basically these amateur radio operators on these sea lanes in off the northern Atlantic, were able to hear a guy reading from the Bible, which I think is interesting because what was Johann Gutenberg's first invention in 1453? He invented a movable metal type. And then what did he do? He basically, he reprinted the Bible, right? So kind of interesting that like religion or military is always kind of the center of these things. But anyway, he played Holy Night, and of course, General Electric, monetarily wise, which was a company that was starting to get its, starting to grow itself in its infancy. Basically saw that this might have some kind of profit to it, and they bankrolled his. They started basically buying patents and for his work. All right, well, we jump ahead now to the radioactive 1912. So as you know, one of the interesting things that happened just prior to the radioactive 1912 was, and again, still radio is not what you think of as radio. Right now, it's basically ship to shore, either voice or by use of Morse code. But one of the things that happens is the Titanic sinks prior, what was that, 1911? I didn't even look that up. Hold on. Let me give you the actual year here, because you're probably screaming at the computer. Oh, when was the Titanic? So the Titanic was, okay, so it was 1912, my bad, April of 1912. So right before the radioactive 1912, the Titanic sinks, and of course the Titanic, was basically using a wireless system and essentially in trying to basically let people know that the ship had run into an iceberg. There was a nearby ship called the Carpathia, I believe is the name of it. And essentially it led to a big shift in how we responded, or what was being put on for a safety measure for ships. It required licensing. It adopted the SOS distress signal. All seafaring vessels were to maintain a 24-hour radio watch and keep in contact with nearby ships and coastal radio stations. It was a critical part of the infrastructure if you were the Navy or you were a commercial vessel that, you were sailing out there in the ocean, particularly in the Atlantic at this point, that you were constantly in contact with either other ships, or you were in contact with, hopefully someone at the shore. So if something happened, like as it did with the Titanic, there would be, at least try to not only get an immediate rescue, but also maybe the Titanic would have been warned that there were icebergs in the area and it would have run into one, right? So if another ship had come through there and had been able to warn the Titanic, it might have worked better. But anyway, I digress. World War I, Navy took control of radio. Of course, World War I happening from 1914 to 1918. And my mouse is being funny over here. And basically, the Navy started cutting deals with, Navy took control of radio, okay, because it was clearly being used at this point as a military application. It was being used as wireless technology, so that pilots could that with ships and pilots could communicate with a crew on the ground, right? All of these things were critical for the war effort between 1914 and 18. Now, the Navy started cutting deals with American companies to prevent new, more powerful technology be sold to foreign entities. Remember, Marconi was someone that was was on the European side. Well, there were a lot of people in the US government that knew that controlling radio and controlling the patents to radio, they were very much interested in having it stay here on this side of the pond, right? So once the war ends in 1918, corporate America recognizes radio's potential. Corporate heads and government leaders conspired to make sure radio served American interests. So they knew in some shape or form, if they could figure out how to make it work to go from military application to consumer application, that this was going to be a really, really profitable form of mass communication. So the formation of RCA. General Electric broke off negotiations to sell radio technologies to European companies, then took the lead in founding the Radio Corporation of America, or RCA. So basically the RCA kind of swallowed up a lot of the things that were being worked on over here. Also, RCA was part of Marconi's company, and swallowed up Marconi's Marconi's efforts, right? And so RCA became a monopoly and gave the United States almost total control over the emerging mass medium of broadcasting. I could get into the weeds with all of this, with the patents and et cetera, but I think just know that RCA is synonymous with, broadcasting from a very, early beginning. All right, so how do you transition then after the war is over? Now it's 1919 and beyond. How do you transition from something that was basically being used from the Navy standpoint to where someone like myself or you could actually start to listen to radio and use radio and all it entails, right? Well, here were some of the things that had to be sort of solved, right? Radio had to transition from a maritime and government entity into a mass medium. It obviously had to be a much smaller size, because if you had seen these radios on these ships back, 120 years ago, they were monstrosities, much like when we talk about computing, early computers in the 1950s were, the size of 2 stories. And of course, now, you could even say this is a computer, right? The phone, okay? Low price, you had to make the radio sets affordable so that the general public could afford them, so that you had you always had a customer base. You obviously had to give people the ability to continue to tune in, right? Regularly scheduled programming, right? So, if you have things that just randomly show up on the radio, people don't have an idea when they should be hopping on. And so therefore it's not a very attractive medium in that regard, right? You have to have clear reception. We'll talk a lot about that, because you had so many, there's going to be a point where so many people jump on and are creating, different stations on different ends of the electromagnetic waves. You get a lot of like crossover, a lot of like, just, it's not clear. So we'll talk about that. And then of course, how do you make money off it? How do you, advertising has to play a role in radio's development, as it does in television, as it has in the internet, as it has in video gaming, as it has in every other form of mass communication. Advertising is a critical part, right? Maybe less so in film, but still there's a huge financial component to film. All right, so I want to introduce you to one of the most, I would say one of the most important historical figures in the broadcast industry in general, period. Now, his name is David Sarnoff. He was alive for 80 years, from the end of the 19th century until literally 1971. And one of the things that made David Sarnoff, and this is not in the book, by the way, one of the things that made David Sarnoff important from the very beginning, or at least someone that was at least could would talk and people would actually listen, maybe a little bit, is that he had a celebrity status, because he was actually one of the people on the shore on the Atlantic seaboard that was actually on duty, I want to say, for something in the neighborhood of like almost 36 straight hours during the Titanic disaster. And he was actually coordinating rescue efforts for the Titanic. So that's kind of his claim to fame. So when people heard of David Sarnoff and heard about, wireless technology, and then being able to connect with people from a wireless standpoint from shore to ship, when he started talking about how to turn that from a military application into maybe a consumer application, people at least heard him. They thought he thought they were a little crazy, but this is what he predicted: a radio music box. He envisioned people listening to news, sports, weather reports, and concerts. Sound familiar, right? He said government should control frequency distribution. He was right about that too, because eventually we get AM and then FM. I'll explain all this coming up. But interestingly enough, a lot of people thought his idea was, although visionary, was too impractical. They didn't see how it could happen. And what's interesting is I call David Sarnoff kind of the Steve Jobs of his era, right? So if you guys have ever known who Steve Jobs is, he was the guy that created Apple and brought us all these things like iPhones and iPads, et cetera. Sarnoff was that guy like 80 years ago. All right, so let's talk about Sarnoff's legacy, because it's all connected to this as we go through here. So Frank Conrad is someone that broadcast his show from his garage as early as 1916. Okay, so he is along with Sarnoff, very much a huge part of radio history. So he was a Westinghouse engineer. Westinghouse established, so they bankrolled him basically as he started to play around with this. He established the first commercial broadcast station, KDKA, in 1920. He ran it out of his garage, by the way, right? And then a local department store sold radio sets to promote his show. So there was right away this connection when people started playing with like radio, and it was going back to Sarnoff, who said, Sarnoff said that you had to connect basically corporate America to this idea of radio. And so Frank Conrad was one of the first to essentially figure out that he could use this new technology to sell things like radio sets, to sell things on behalf of Westinghouse by using his radio program to promote it, right? Charles Doc Harold began a station in 1909 that later became KCBS. By 1921, so a year after KDKA comes on the air, there were 5 radio stations licensed for operation. By 1923, more than 600 commercial and non-commercial stations. And all these stations, by the way, were being started by grocery chains, automotive stores, department stores. They were literally utilizing this idea of radio, of putting stuff on radio to sell things. Sound familiar? It's kind of how we roll today, even in 2022. All right, by 1926, you now start to have networks come along. NBC, a subsidiary of RCA, is created in 1926. CBS makes its debut in 1927. Networks begin reserving time slots with local stations for national advertising. There was this idea, obviously, of centralizing costs and programming. Everything that David Sarnoff had talked about, had envisioned, is now coming true, right? Now, you have to also remember during this time, this is all very national. This isn't very local. So if you were listening to radio, early radio, radio was actually like television, that we know television today, where television is very national, radio is very national in its infancy, meaning you didn't have a lot of local stations. That kind of happens later. All right. But here's the issue. Because things happen so quickly, because you go from 5 licensed stations in 1921 to 600 by 1923, you have too many stations coming up on too many places on the frequency. So therefore, it's all garbled. So let me give you like an example. So if you've ever driven here in the evening out here in Santa Clarita or the Antelope Valley, or maybe you're in Ventura County, wherever you might be, maybe you're down in Burbank, turn on an AM station at night and see if you can hear other stations bleeding over. And it's a real problem. Now, you can go to a station that has a clear signal, but just try flipping your tuner and see how often you hear bleed, right? And that's because, you're crisscrossing frequencies from stations that are in different cities, particularly on AM, from all over the country. So like if you're in the Antelope Valley at night, you can sometimes pick up stations that are 500 miles away, 1,000 miles away. In fact, when I was at the University of Colorado, I would drive up to go skiing at this area, and it was like, you had to go over like this 9,000 foot like mountain pass to get there. And if it was a clear night, you could literally go up to the top of the Rocky Mountains, and I could listen to KNX radio from LA, 1070. I could listen to a St. Louis station. I could listen to a station in Albuquerque, which was, 500 miles south. It was because the signal was so amplified and it was kind of everywhere. But anyway, I digress. So the Radio Act of 1927, basically, which is a forerunner to the FCC being established in 1934, which is that stations could only license their channels as long as they operated to serve the public interest, convenience, or necessity. It also established the Federal Radio Commission, or FRC, which essentially meant when you applied for a radio license, you had to make sure that whatever frequency you were put on AM radio at that point, not FM, but on AM, that there wasn't another station occupying that same kind of like area. So it made a big difference. Early radio programming. Okay, so this basically was another Sarnoff issue, which is obviously, trying to establish, clear signals on radio. Here's your regular programming. Early radio programming, only a handful of stations. There was live music daily. There were 15-minute evening programs, really, really, low-key stuff, variety shows, quiz shows, dramatic programs. Most of these early radio programs were sponsored only by a single sponsor. So it would be like, Crest toothpaste sponsors this, or Texaco sponsors that. It wasn't being sponsored by a number of different companies. When that happens, that's when you start to see, a greater length of regular programming. And this also happens in television. So when we circle back to television, you'll see there's some definite connections between radio and TV. All right. So as for advertising, there was selling of airtime was the way to stay profitable and remain in business. So right away, there was this notion that if you sold advertising, that brought in money, which kept the lights on, which made you profitable, right? And that's something that's been in place, forever. And so radio was the first to really kind of establish it. Television then, of course, does it. And you could say that now, of course, we're being, in the digital realm, the amount of clicks are what is driving, the financial needle. But so there are two different types of advertising. Again, the initial model was institutional advertising, which is one sponsor, one program. And then later product advertising becomes more popular. Again, I'll reiterate this when we get to television, it becomes popular because you literally could, by selling, well, let's just say the fact is that if you're one sponsor, one program, you have a lot of creative control over that. So if someone is doing something that you don't like, if they're talking to someone you don't like, if you want to see, let's say that the show gets a little too risque and it's pushing away your audience, well, it's very easy to just say, you know what, if you don't change direction, we'll just pull our advertising. That can be a very, very difficult thing for a radio station to maintain. But if you have a multitude of advertisers, it's not so much. So anyway, we'll talk more about that when we get to television as well, because it does play a huge role. But the bottom line is, with advertising, what I do want you to understand is that companies are spending more than $27 million. That is $27 million in those terms annually by the late 1920s. In fact, let's see, I'm going to type this in real quick. What is 27 million? Dollars in 25 worth today, and that would be the equivalent of 16, if I'm not mistaken, if I'm reading this right, this is right, $16 billion today. So you can see that, obviously very large, lot of money. All right, this era, by the way, between 1930 and 1945 was called the golden age of radio, okay? So many programs on television today initially got their start in radio. Weather forecasts, farm reports began in the 1920s. News analysis began in 1927. Again, radio was the only game in town at this point, other than if you picked up a newspaper or a magazine. So in terms of being able to actually, when it came to broadcasting, this was it. Television doesn't come along quite yet, right? There was a variety of content, including comedy, dance, live sports, political talk, daytime soap operas, and news. Radio couldn't have come along at a better time, by the way, because in 1929, October of 1929, the stock market crashes. We get the Great Depression, and the two forms of mass media that absolutely came out glowing during this time was radio and film. Television hasn't happened yet, so you can't even include television there. But again, think about when COVID hit in March of 2020. What did we do? We literally went either to video games or Netflix, right? That was our diversion. Well, in 1930, when 1 out of every 4 Americans is out of work, and it's the, arguably the worst, financial downturn we've ever had in our history, radio became the entertainment. Film became the entertainment. And you can see advertising grows from 40 million in 1930 to 112 million in 1935. Just staggering numbers for that day and age, right? Because people were tuning in to radio programming. It kept growing. One of the interesting parts of, and if I can, I will actually, there's a link there's links at the bottom of this PowerPoint that I would encourage you to click on. I'll try to remember to put them in on the resource page, because I know in part one we also have some resources. There's some stuff I want you to click on. But also, radio's power was really like television's power now, in that people were transfixed with programming. And one of those early, I would say early iterations of just like remember how Tiger King swept the country 2 years ago? Well, one of those kind of vibes was Orson Welles, who obviously does Citizen Kane. Orson Welles, famous Hollywood director. He was also into radio heavily as a much younger guy. So he actually created this thing called the War of the Worlds on Halloween Eve in 1938 in the style of a radio news program. And basically what he did is that he took over, instead of people listening all night to the Columbia Music Theater on this station in New York, he would break into coverage to start talking about this alien invasion of New York, New Jersey, and other parts of the US. And he made it so convincing that it actually created panic. And what it wound up doing was it prompted the FCC to call for stricter warnings before and during programs imitating the style of radio news. So he ran a disclaimer at the very beginning of this thing and then never ran another one. And so if you kind of tuned in sort of midstream, out of context, you would have thought that we were undergoing an alien invasion. So it was brilliant stuff, but ultimately it led to some the FCC having to step in and sort of tweak some rules, if you will. All right, transistors make radio portable. Okay, so from the technological end, these transistors, small electrical devices that could receive and amplify radio signals, right? So that we go from having these huge radio sets in living rooms to suddenly now you could take radio on the go. So it became very portable. They were more durable, less expensive than vacuum tubes. They used less power, produced less heat. They led to the creation of small pocket radios and, really kind of ushered in radio's portability for years to come. And of course, I've seen it in my lifetime change quite a bit. At one point we had these boom boxes that you can carry on your shoulder, and, now they're relics in your parents' or grandparents' attic. But yeah, so that we owe transistors a debt of gratitude for it. FM, Edwin Armstrong. This is a name you're going to definitely want to remember. Edwin Armstrong actually is the father of FM radio, which is called frequency modulation. Now, a little hard to describe on a YouTube page, but what I'll try to say is basically AM signal, which is like KFI, for example, 640 goes all around, right? That's why and depending on how much it's amplified, it can literally be thrown, 2 states over, especially at night. FM is more straight line. So if you have an FM, transmitter, coming from, say, like K-Rock, right, or K-Earth 101, it's basically having to go through a mountain to get here. And so that's why when you tune on FM radio here in Santa Clarita, because we're in a valley, in a bowl, it's a lot harder to get FM radio here than it is AM radio. And that's but FM fidelity is much, much sharper and nicer than AM fidelity is. What's interesting is that basically it came along, it was invented in the 1930s, and it came along at a weird time because Edwin Armstrong's invention came along at the same time television was being invented. And so David Sarnoff was starting at that point he was starting to drift away from radio and get into television. And it kind of got shelved. And so it doesn't really come up until the 1960s again, where, radio started looking for more, was looking for more space. And so they turned to FM to increase that. So, and you can see by the 1980s that FM had surpassed AM radio. So it's interesting how FM's history has kind of worked over the years. Television, woo, man, here comes television right now. We'll obviously have, chapter 6 will be a separate chapter in its own on television and its obviously its importance and founding, etc. But remember that television really comes along. It starts being experimented with in the late 20s and the 30s, but It's after World War II in 1946 that television really starts to take off as what radio was doing in the early 1920s as a broad form of mass communication. When it happens, and again, it happened so quickly, 5,000 US homes in 1946, 90 million by 1960. It marks the only time in media history when a new medium stole virtually every national programming and advertising strategy from an old medium. So everything that radio is known for goes to television, and it particularly goes on a national scale. Program genres, advertisers, celebrities, live audiences all jump to television. So anybody that you thought of as a celebrity was a radio celebrity in the 1920s, and in particular the 1930s. They all go to television. Sales of TVs increased 500%. Audience grows 4,000% in just 2 years. And David Sarnoff, the father of radio, the head of RCA, says, sorry, but you think radio is going to die. He jumps and starts paying attention, all of his attention to television, which we'll swing back to him when we get to TV. Sad, right? Well, not really, because radio is forced to reinvent itself. And something that we talked about in chapter 4, remember in sound, we talked about how rock and roll kind of comes up in the early to mid 50s, right? And the idea of the top 40. Well, radio has to reinvent itself. So it literally goes to two different things to make a difference. One is format radio, which I'll talk about here in a second. And it also goes local. Instead of being national, because all the national stuff is now being handled by ABC, CBS, NBC, et cetera. I think ABC came along in the 50s, whatever, you know what I mean? We get format local radio that really becomes a thing starting in the 1950s. And what that is that it was developed by Todd Storrs in 1949. He used think about it like a clock or like a pie. And, you would tune in, like, let's say you're a radio station playing, rock and roll music. You'd play the same songs virtually in the same order every hour on a continuous basis, like 24/7, right? And that was called a rotation. And it led to the development of the top 40 format. And it led to a program log. It led to advertising breaks every quarter hour so they could sell a bunch of advertising in between the songs playing. And it was incredibly popular. Radio stations grew sharply between 1955 and 1970, increasing to more than 7,000. So radio really becomes synonymous, not with news, not with, variety shows or all that stuff that it got, live sporting events, all that stuff that went to television. It's a lot of music. And of course, some of it's now, it has, in modern times, it's come back a little bit. Obviously, there's still sports on radio and news on radio, but really, music becomes a big part of the radio landscape, because of the top 40. But it also led to something called payola, which is that basically, because they're on a rotation and it's the same songs all the time, there was this desire, if you were an independent, record producer or a struggling record producer or record label, to try to get your stuff played into this top 40. Because once you do, then you can, not only is the radio station making money, but you're also making money as an artist and you're making money as a label, right? And so they started paying DJs under the table with cash to essentially sneak in songs so the songs could become more popular and you could sell more records. And that was highly illegal, but it was also rampant in the 1950s. It eventually becomes illegal. And in 2007, by the way, just so you know, it still happens in pretty recent times, 4 of the largest broadcasting companies agreed to pay $12.5 million to settle a payola investigation by the FCC. So look up payola. It's a very interesting subject. So we talked about FM coming back in the 1960s, right, with the expansion of FM, which created room for experimenting. So we start to see things like progressive rock, alternative rock, general classic rock, all of these formats that, again, we talked about in chapter 4, where we saw these different sort of musicians playing music. Now they have an avenue because they could do it in, obviously, the top 40 format was pretty much an AM centric thing for a long time. FM becomes more of the independent side, right? And by 1990, FM accounts for 70% of listening time. How about nonprofit radio and national public radio, or NPR? The early years of nonprofit radio, in 1948, the government began authorizing non-commercial licenses, approved 10-watt FM stations. I can tell you, for example, when in my very beginnings at the University of Colorado, I did radio, and we were in this tiny little low-powered station in the basement of our student center that was broadcasting, to a handful of dorms, and we were also tied into local TV cable, so we at least were on the cable channel. But these were, these really like low wattage, stations. FM were go as far back as 1948. With the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967, National Public Radio, or NPR, and PBS, which is obviously the television side, Sesame Street, remember Sesame Street, they were created and mandated to provide alternatives to commercial broadcasting. So they are actually, their funding structure is through grants and through companies kind of bankrolling programming, not really sponsoring programming. It's kind of a subtle difference. AM turns to talk radio. So the Fairness Doctrine, which is a pretty big deal, in 1987, basically the Fairness Doctrine was something that overturned a 1947 FCC rule that laid out equal time. So if, for example, you wanted to talk about conservative politics and you spent 2 hours, that meant that you had to have 2 hours of what would be the 180 of that, right? Something that was an opposing viewpoint. Well, that actually was overturned in 1987 by Congress. And when that happened, it actually then led to a very big shift in radio. So music, for the most part, was now going to FM radio. AM was trying to figure out how to sort of stay profitable. And so political talk radio, in particular, Rush Limbaugh, who just recently passed away, Rush Limbaugh, who was kind of the father of talk radio, started a program, I should say, in Sacramento, and then became nationally syndicated. And then AM companies that were, that owned AM properties realized that there was this entire untapped resource of conservative talk radio being, attracting advertisers, and there was a lot of money involved. And so it actually led to this huge resurgence in AM radio. And of course, a lot of that conservative, and that's why you have a lot of conservative talk radio. And they could do it because you could have conservative talk radio on all day, all night, and not have to worry about having to put an opposing viewpoint on because of the Fairness Doctrine being lifted in 1987. So still in play today. All right. Also, Telecommunications Act of 1996, another big part of radio history. It eliminated most ownership restrictions in radio. It also had, stuff to do with television as well, but radio was really kind of the big one. It led to an avalanche of buying and selling radio properties. So it kind of lifted the idea of, say, like iHeartMedia, Cumulus, Townsquare, which are the big ones today. It sort of lifted this idea that you could only own a couple of radio stations in a given market. It lifted that to, I believe, 8. It lifted the cap to 8. So suddenly, these companies that were making money off of AM, in particular talk radio, were able to duplicate that, in the same market over several stations or over multiple cities. And radio stations grew, the idea of a radio corporation started growing tremendously because of the Telecommunications Act. Now, together today, iHeartMedia, Cumulus, and Townsquare Media, those are your 3 biggies. They own roughly 1,700 radio stations across the country. That's more than 11% of all the radio stations. They dominate the 50 largest markets, and they control about 1/3 of the entire radio industry's nearly $17.6 billion in revenue. So that's because of the Telecommunications Act. All right, internet radio emerges in the 1990s. Broadcast radio stations now have an online presence because of convergence. There's that word again. 12,300 radio stations streaming programming today. Online only radio stations like Pandora, of course, have grown in popularity. I know a lot of you either have Spotify, maybe you have Pandora. A lot of you, obviously have iHeart. iHeart has a huge system. Bottom line is you can listen to just about any radio station across the country online now, which is really cool. I love that we have those choices. Other recent news: in 2002, the Copyright Royalty Board assessed royalty fees for streaming copyrighted songs over the web. In 2009, internet stations were able to negotiate royalty fees directly with the music industry at a reasonable cost. In 2012, Clear Channel strikes a deal with the recording industry. Clear Channel was basically the parent station to iHeartMedia back when the Telecommunications Act happened. So if you go back and look at Telecommunications Act, it was Clear Channel that was there first, and then later it becomes iHeartMedia in 2014. And podcasting, of course, has its infancy back in 2004. See, I told you we'd go full circle if you listen to part one, right? So if we've listened to part one. Radio advertising now, by the way, comprises 10% of media advertising. Industry revenue has dropped, but the number of stations keeps growing. That's in large part to the internet. Only 20% of the budget goes toward programming costs. So it's not like television where you have to build expensive sets or pay actors an exorbitant fee. It very much is. That's not the same with radio versus television. National networks still provide programming in exchange for time slots for national ads, although getting significantly less. Radio stations pull their largest revenue from local advertising. So nearly 78 cents out of every dollar is earned from local advertising. And that's critical because local and radio kind of go together like peas and carrots. Feedback, by the way. So how many people are listening to a given radio station, to a given program? That is provided by the Nielsen company, which also does television, by the way. That is that's certainly how they measure, right? Nielsen surveys 280 markets across the United States, reports its results to broadcasters and advertisers. Generally speaking, the larger your audience, the more you can charge for advertising, the more profitable you can become. So, you look at, say, for example, a radio station like Kiss FM here in Los Angeles. It's a station that, everybody can hear all over LA. So when you're charging advertising for Kiss FM, it's significantly more than, for example, KHTS Radio, which is a tiny little AM radio station right here in Santa Clarita. But the bottom line is people are chosen at random. My wife most recently got, I think, $5 or $10 for filling out a log sheet. I think it's interesting. And of course, I think one of the more fascinating things is trying to figure out the audience now, because we're doing video streams and listening on Spotify, et cetera. It's very difficult to figure out exactly where people are actually watching or listening to this kind of stuff. When they do so, though, they're measured by two things, which is rating and share. I invite you, in the interest of time, to look this up on your own, but I will give you kind of the basic definition, which is to say, rating is a ratio of listeners of a particular station to all the people in the market. Share, the equation is a ratio of listeners to a particular station to the total number of radio listeners in the market. And so, for example, I have a number. I'll give you like a TV example here. So if I scroll down here, so here's an example. So ratings are essentially percentages measuring the portions of a given group, be it households, adults 18 to 49 or women 25 to 54, watching a given show, because that's the primary age group that buys the most stuff. Adults 18 to 49 is the primary demographic by which ad rates are set for entertainment programming. So a 2.0 rating for the Masked Singer means that 2% of the people in that age range, roughly 2.56 million people, watch the show. A share is the percentage of a given group who are watching TV at that time and are tuned into a given program. Wednesday's Masked Singer had a 10 share in adults 18 to 49, meaning 10% of adults under 50 who had their TVs on at that hour watched it. So it's typically written as rating or a share. So the share is always going to be higher than the rating. All right. And just in case you hear about total viewers, pretty self-explanatory. The average number of people watching or listening to a program in any given minute while it airs, that would be total viewers or listeners. So anyway, that is, the economics of radio. One last slide here before I say goodbye for chapter 5. I will plant these links for you on the same page as the stuff from part 1 so that they're kind of all in one spot, but you can also link through here as well. When I normally have an in-person class, I like to play this stuff because it's so interesting. I would invite you to click on War of the Worlds, not the movie that was made with Tom Cruise about 10 years ago. No, I'm talking about Orson Welles' War of the Worlds. Listen to an excerpt of it. It's very, very interesting. Pearl Harbor, I want you to listen to a moment in time from December 7th of 1941 when Pearl Harbor was attacked, because people tuned into radio up until television came along. Radio was the primary form of how people got information, in real time when it came to breaking news, to wars, to national disasters, etc. Pearl Harbor, I want you to listen to it because it is so interesting how it's presented. There are also, by the way, some fascinating stuff on YouTube. If you search, speech, like right now we're talking about Ukraine being invaded with Vladimir Putin, and there's some fascinating, CBS News has some fascinating, audio out there on YouTube when Adolf Hitler was declaring war on Poland in 1939. And how our news people were reacting to it at the time. So a lot of people say there's some parallels between, 1939 with Neville Chamberlain in England and how Europe was, handling Hitler, just like how we apparently are handling Ukraine at the moment and Russia. And so I would encourage you to listen. It's really fascinating. And then last but not least, probably I think the most famous event ever on radio was the day that Lee Harvey Oswald, the man who shot and assassinated President Kennedy, was shot himself dead while being transported from a police station to a police car. And so we will never know exactly the true and full story of what happened with the Kennedy assassination, because a guy named Jack Ruby, a nightclub owner from Dallas, shot Lee Harvey Oswald. You hear it happen live on this link, which is really chilling. So in any event, that is part 2 of radio. Next time, you'll probably click on something. You'll probably see me talking about television. But I just want to wish you a great day or evening or whenever you watch this, and make sure that you work your way through the modules so that you get everything taken care of. Okay, that's it. We'll see you next time.